I'd heard whispers about room 306 at the old Victorian hotel, but I dismissed them as ghost stories to spook tourists. When I checked in for a weekend getaway, the receptionist hesitated before giving me the key to that very room. Her eyes flickered with something like fear, but she said nothing. The room was quaint but had an unsettling air. The wallpaper, a faded floral pattern, seemed to shift in the dim light. I shrugged off the feeling and settled in, determined to enjoy my stay. After a long day exploring the town, I returned to find the room cold, unnaturally so. I adjusted the thermostat, but the chill persisted. That night, I awoke to the sound of scratching. It was faint but unmistakable. I turned on the lamp, but nothing seemed amiss. As I lay back down, the scratching grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the closet. My heart pounded as I approached and, with trembling hands, flung the door open. The closet was empty. Shaken, I shut the door and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Sleep eluded me, and the scratching continued intermittently. Around 3 a.m., the room's temperature plummeted further, and I saw my breath fog up in front of me. Then, I heard a whisper, soft, unintelligible, but undeniably real. It was coming from beneath the bed. Gathering my courage, I knelt down and lifted the dust ruffle. I was met with a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I screamed and stumbled backward, hitting my head on the nightstand. Dazed, I saw a figure, a woman in a tattered dress, her face pale and twisted in anguish, emerge from under the bed. She reached out, her fingers skeletal and cold, and whispered, "Help me." I bolted from the room and didn't stop until I reached the lobby. The receptionist saw my panic and simply nodded. She explained that years ago, a woman had been murdered in room 306 by her jealous lover. Her body was hidden under the bed, and her spirit had never left. I demanded a new room and spent the rest of the night sleepless, haunted by the woman's eyes. I checked out first thing in the morning, vowing never to return. As I left, I glanced back at the hotel and saw her in the window of room 306, watching me leave. I was attending a conference at a large, modern hotel, known for its sleek design and cutting-edge technology. Everything about the place was state-of-the-art, from the touch-screen check-in kiosks to the smart elevators. It was the kind of place that screamed efficiency and comfort. After a long day of networking and lectures, I decided to retire early. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for my floor, the 15th. The door slid shut, and the elevator began its smooth ascent. As I leaned against the wall, I felt a strange sensation, as if the elevator was moving faster than usual. The display above the door showed the floors ticking by rapidly, but then something strange happened. The numbers began to blur and flicker, then vanished altogether. The elevator shuddered and stopped abruptly, the lights dimming to an eerie red. I pressed the button for my floor again, but nothing happened. I hit the emergency button, but there was no response. Panic set in. I fished out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Suddenly, the elevator jerked violently and started moving again, only this time, it wasn't going up or down. It felt like it was moving sideways, or in some direction that defied logic. The sensation was disorienting, and I clung to the handrail, my mind racing. The doors finally opened, revealing a dimly lit hallway that I didn't recognize. It looked like part of the hotel, but something was off. The walls were lined with old, peeling wallpaper, and the air smelled musty. I stepped out cautiously, calling out for help, but my voice echoed unanswered. As I walked down the corridor, I noticed the doors were all slightly ajar, and an eerie silence filled the space. I peeked into one of the rooms and froze. Inside was a scene from a bygone era: antique furniture, dusty chandeliers, and a sense of abandonment. On the bed lay a figure, still and lifeless. I backed away, my heart pounding. Desperate, I ran back to the elevator, but it was gone. In its place was a brick wall. I was trapped. I sprinted down the hallway, looking for another exit, but every turn led me back to the same corridor. It was as if the hotel had become a labyrinth, twisting and turning to keep me inside. Then, I heard it, a low, guttural whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it grew louder, more insistent. Shadows moved along the walls, and I felt an oppressive presence closing in. I stumbled into another room and slammed the door behind me, breathing heavily. The whispering stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. I turned to find myself face to face with an old mirror. In its reflection, I saw not myself, but a figure standing behind me, a tall, shadowy form with hollow eyes. It reached out, and I felt its icy grip on my shoulder. I screamed and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the original elevator, the doors open to my floor. The numbers were back, and everything seemed normal. I stumbled out, shaken and bewildered, and made my way to my room. I checked out the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that I had experienced something otherworldly. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for certain: I'll never set foot in that hotel again. I had always been fascinated by old hotels, so when I found out about the century-old establishment in a small, forgotten town, I booked a room immediately. The hotel was a beautiful relic of a bygone era, with ornate woodwork and vintage furnishings. It felt like stepping back in time. My room was on the top floor, and it had a large antique mirror that dominated one wall. I admired its craftsmanship, the intricate designs on the frame, and the way it seemed to glow in the dim light. That first night, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the creaking sounds of the old building. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. I sat up and looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The tapping continued, seeming to come from the direction of the mirror. I got up and approached it, my curiosity piqued. As I stood in front of the mirror, the tapping stopped. I stared at my reflection, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. I laughed nervously and went back to bed, attributing the experience to my overactive imagination. The next day, I explored the town and spoke with some locals. When I mentioned where I was staying, their expressions changed. They warned me about the mirror, saying it had a dark history. According to legend, a previous guest had become obsessed with it and claimed to see visions in its reflection. He eventually went mad and took his own life in that very room. That night, I couldn't shake their words. As I prepared for bed, I avoided looking at the mirror, but it seemed to draw my gaze. I turned off the lights and crawled under the covers, trying to ignore the sense of unease that had settled over me. At around 2 a.m., the tapping started again, louder this time. I sat up and saw a faint glow coming from the mirror. My heart raced as I got out of bed and slowly approached it. The reflection was dim, but I could see someone moving behind me. It was a man, his face gaunt and eyes hollow, standing just behind my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. Panic set in, and I decided to cover the mirror with a blanket. As I reached up to drape it over the frame, the man in the mirror grabbed my wrist. His touch was ice cold, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. He leaned in close, his eyes filled with despair, and whispered, "Help me." I yanked my hand free and stumbled back, knocking over a lamp in my haste. The light flickered on, and the man vanished. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, watching the mirror with wide eyes. The next morning, I checked out as soon as the sun rose. The receptionist gave me a knowing look but said nothing. As I left, I glanced back at the room's window and saw the man standing there, watching me leave. I've never been able to forget that night or the desperate plea of the man in the mirror. I still avoid mirrors in dark rooms, afraid of what I might see looking back at me. I was traveling through Europe, backpacking from city to city, when I stumbled upon a quaint, little hotel in a remote village. It seemed perfect for a night's rest, with its charming facade and welcoming staff. The receptionist handed me a key and directed me to a room at the end of a long hallway. Oddly, the room had no number on the door, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The room was simple but comfortable, with an old-fashioned bed and a small window overlooking the courtyard. I unpacked my things and settled in, feeling a strange but not unpleasant sense of isolation. As night fell, I lay down to sleep, enjoying the quiet. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud banging on the door. Startled, I jumped up and hurried to see who it was, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Confused, I shut the door and went back to bed, thinking it must have been a prank or a mistake. An hour later, the banging started again, this time louder and more insistent. I ran to the door, heart pounding, but again, there was no one there. Frustrated and a little scared, I decided to stay awake, hoping to catch whoever was behind the disturbance. As I sat in the dark, I began to notice strange noises, whispers, footsteps, and soft sobbing. The sounds seemed to come from the walls themselves. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself it was just my imagination, but they grew louder and more persistent. Then, the door started to rattle as if someone was trying to force it open. Terrified, I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, hoping to keep whatever was out there from getting in. The banging continued, more furious than before, and I could hear a voice, faint and desperate, pleading for help. Suddenly, the room went cold, and a heavy fog seeped in from under the door, filling the room. I could barely see anything, but I felt a presence, something malevolent and ancient. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, as the fog coalesced into a figure. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. She reached out to me, her voice a mournful wail. "Help me," she cried, her form flickering like a dying candle. "He's coming." Before I could react, the door burst open, and a shadowy figure stood in the doorway. The woman screamed and vanished into the fog, which dissipated as quickly as it had appeared. The shadow lingered for a moment, then melted into the darkness. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my things and fled the room, not stopping until I reached the lobby. The receptionist looked up, surprised to see me in such a state. When I told her what happened, she paled and said, "That room was sealed for a reason. It doesn't have a number because it's not supposed to be used." She explained that years ago, a guest had been murdered in that room by her jealous lover. Her spirit had been trapped there ever since, and anyone who stayed in the room was doomed to relive her final moments. I checked out immediately and left the village at dawn, vowing never to return. The experience haunts me to this day, and I still hear her desperate cries in my nightmares.